All right, congratulations. You made it through part one of that brain lecture. We're going to move on to part two. And what I'm going to talk about now is memory a little bit and the cerebrum. So we left off, we kind of identified Wernicke's area, Broca's area. We identified all the lobes of the brain, and then we kind of identified where those regions, as far as those senses, are going to be processed at. That's where we kind of left things off at. Now what we're going to talk a little bit about is memory. And what we have is we have short-term memory, we have long-term memory, and we have this other stuff that's called sensory memory. Sensory memory is going to be mostly stored in the temporal lobe, is where we're going to have it. And what I mean by sensory memory is, say that I have like an object here, and this is a marker. Okay, so say that I have this marker here, and this marker goes away. Okay, you're still able to recall what that marker looked like. That marker will eventually get put into short-term memory and maybe even put into long-term memory. But that sensory memory, what it's going to do is it's going to kind of remember what that object looked like, even though that object's no longer in direct sight. And that's going to be in the temporal lobe. Now, memory is stored throughout the whole entire cerebrum itself. But as far as short-term and long-term memory, the frontal lobe has a major component dealing with those two types of memory that we have as far as short-term and long-term memory. We're kind of thinking of the frontal lobe. I know when you do research and you get really complex, you get into that temporal lobe, you get into the hippocampus deep within that temporal lobe, and things like that. For all intents and purposes of this class, we're just going to kind of relate short-term and long-term memory. A major constituent is going to be within that frontal lobe. So inside of the cerebrum, we have these layers, and inside of neural tissue anyway, of the brain, when we cut it open, we're going to see areas of gray and we're going to see areas of white. So we call this gray matter and we call white matter. And gray matter and white matter, now we're going to get down to the neuron level and kind of see what's going on there as far as with gray matter and white matter. So gray matter is mostly going to be composed of cell bodies. So if you remember a neuron, this is just a generalized neuron. This is going to be a multipolar neuron, which most of the neurons in your brain are going to be multipolar because they're association neurons. Okay, so this is my generalized neuron that's here. This top portion right here is called the cell body. So this is the cell body that's all right here. So this whole structure right here is the cell body. Okay, this giant rod-like structure coming all the way down here, okay, this is the axon, and then down here is the axon terminal that I have that I've circled right here. So this is the axon, okay, and the axon appears to be white in color. All right, when I have a collection of these neurons, all the axons appear to be white, and the cell bodies, which are these structures that are here, that I told you, I'm just going to label them CB, a generic C and a generic B that we have here. They're going to be gray in color. So this is going to be gray. Put it with a G for gray. This is going to be white in color when I have a collection of these. What this tells you is, remember, with a neuron, electrical information is going to run this way. They always run from the dendrites down the axon. These little appendages coming off of the cell body right here. These are all dendrites that are right here. But if I have a collection of cell bodies, this is where information is going to be probably processed at, is in this gray matter, and then this white matter is like what it's traveling through. So it kind of clues me in as to what's going on in that particular area of the brain. If I see a bunch of white matter, that's going to tell me that information is just traveling through that area. Gray matter means that information is being kind of processed in that particular area. I'm going to switch over to the brain itself, and we're just going to take a look at gray matter, and we're going to take a look at white matter, and we're going to take a look at one area inside of the brain called the corpus callosum. It's also called the corpus callosum, depending upon what anatomy teacher that you have at the next level. We're going to take a look at one of these massive white areas of the brain, and we're really going to take a look at it and describe its function as well. All right, so this is the inside of the brain that we have right here. My lighting's okay, but right here is the corpus callosum that's right here. And you can see it's all white matter that's right here. It's all white matter, okay? And then out here I can see this is like a change of color. This is what we call gray matter out here. So all this gray matter is telling me out here that there's a ton of cell bodies that are located out here. This white matter that's right here is telling me there's a ton of axons, these nerve tracts, that are right here. So this is a whole bunch of axons that are running here. There's over 200 million axons that are running through the corpus callosum. That's right here. And the corpus callosum allows the right hemisphere of the brain to communicate with the left hemisphere. So both hemispheres are communicating with one another effectively as a result of this whole set of axons that are running right through here in this corpus callosum. Now when I also look inside the brain, I can see there's open space that's in here as well. These are ventricles of the brain that we have as well. So there are open spaces within the brain. It's just not solid neural tissue. There are these solid open spaces that we have down here. When I look at the cerebellum, I can see we have this other area that's down here, that we have all this white matter that's right here. And then we have these little flecks of gray matter that are in here as well. So that's the difference between gray matter and white matter. I can even take this brain tissue, this brain itself, and I'm going to cut it, and we're going to take a look inside the brain tissue as well when I open it up. And I can see, as I look inside of it even more, I can see there's also flecks of gray and flecks of white. But I can see there's gray matter that's right here, and then there's this white matter that's right here as well. So we can see the gray matter and the white matter in the brain itself. Remember, that white matter is going to clue me in that, hey, there's a bunch of axons that are in that location. That gray matter is going to clue me in that, hey, there's a bunch of cell bodies. That's where information is being processed, and the axons is where that information is running through or running to, is what's going on there. So that's the difference between gray matter and white matter. I think that's pretty cool. So now we're going to move into this area that we call the diencephalon, which is on the inside of the brain. So you have to cut the brain open to get into the diencephalon. The diencephalon consists of this structure right here. I'm drawing a circle around that is called the thalamus. So that's the thalamus. Okay, I'll label it with a little T right here. Okay, so that's the thalamus that's right there. If I'm standing in the thalamus and I look down, on the floor of the thalamus is going to be the hypothalamus. So this structure all in here is called the hypothalamus, and it's part of the diencephalon as well. I'm going to label this with an H. So there's my little H that's right there. And then on the roof of the thalamus, if I look up, I have another structure that's up here that's called the epithalamus. So the diencephalon consists of the thalamus, the epithalamus, and the hypothalamus. Off of the hypothalamus, we have a gland that's here. This is a famous gland that's called the pituitary gland. That's part of your endocrine system. Interesting thing about the hypothalamus is both neural tissue and it's also glandular tissue as well. So the hypothalamus kind of has a neural function, and it also has a glandular function with the endocrine system as well. So it's glandular tissue and it's nervous tissue. It's a pretty cool little structure of the brain. And that's what we're going to take a look at next, is we're going to take a look at this diencephalon structure. And you can see on here, this is that whole diencephalon structure that's all right here that we're looking at in this generalized area here. And that's what we're going to be talking about real briefly, just about the function of those particular structures themselves. Again, just to reiterate, we talked about the three parts of the diencephalon: the thalamus, the hypothalamus, and the epithalamus. We're going to talk about what these structures do next. So the thalamus acts like a relay station for sensory impulses, is what it's going to do. So sensory information is going to come into the brain via sensory neuron. And then your thalamus, which is hanging out right here, it routes the sensory information with the correct association neuron and takes it to the correct region of the brain to be interpreted. So for instance, this is vision that's coming in. So this is a sensory neuron dealing with sight. And we know that vision gets processed in the occipital lobe. So the thalamus acts like an operator and is going to route it to the correct association neuron and for it to be processed into the occipital lobe. Okay? Let's say that you have some feeling of touch in your hand. Well, touch gets processed into the sensory cortex in the parietal lobe. So it comes into here, and then the thalamus is like, we want to route you to go over to this particular region of the brain for you to be processed. So we take a look at a generalized function of the thalamus. A generalized function for it is going to be a relay station for sensory impulses. So it's going to transfer these impulses to the correct parts of the cortex for interpretation, is what it's going to do. So when this sensory information comes in through the thalamus then routes it to the correct location of the brain for it to be interpreted and for it to be processed, is what's going to happen in the thalamus. So the thalamus kind of acts like an operator. What it's going to do, like way back in the day, you used to press 0 on your phone. And we press 0, you would tell them that, hey, you know what? I want to know the phone number to blah, blah, blah pizza shop. And the operator would be like, oh, here's the pizza shop's number. Do you want me to connect you to the pizza shop? And then they would connect you to it. So I always envision the thalamus as acting like an old school operator back in the day. Of course, now we have cell phones and we have Google and things like that we automatically are able to be, routed to that correct location that we need to go to after we type in that particular word. But that's kind of how this game is being played. Sensory information comes in, and your thalamus is like, oh, this type of sensory information, it gets processed, boom, over here. Let's hook you up with the correct association neuron. And that's what the thalamus is going to do. Now, the hypothalamus is super cool. The hypothalamus is one of my favorite structures. Like I said earlier, the hypothalamus is both glandular tissue and it's nervous tissue. It's one of the coolest regions of the body, if you ask me, or coolest regions of the brain. Remember, if I'm standing in the thalamus and I look down, beneath me is going to be the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus has a variety of functions. Some of its major functions are going to be help to regulate our body temperature, is one thing that it does. It helps control our water balance. It has a lot of hormones in it that are called releasing hormones that we have, that if you take a look at my endocrine lectures, I kind of explain those in great detail. It also helps regulate our metabolism, so it controls the speed or the amount of chemical reactions that we have going on inside of our body. It also is part of our limbic system, so it's also going to be an important part of our emotional control center. And then, of course, attached to it is the pituitary gland. So the hypothalamus communicates with the pituitary gland regularly through hormones that it produced, and then neurologically through neurons that it will fire into the posterior pituitary to get hormones to be released. So the next structure that we have is the epithalamus. If I'm in the thalamus and I look up, I'm going to see the epithalamus. Now, the epithalamus is cool in that it is the area that has some choroid plexuses that are going to produce cerebrospinal fluid. If you remember, cerebrospinal fluid is this clear fluid that's going to bathe the central nervous system. It's going to provide nutrients to the central nervous system, waste products to the central nervous system. It's also going to cushion them, the brain itself, to help prevent injury and things like that. So this spinal fluid, cerebrospinal fluid, is vitally important. Towards the back of the epithalamus, we have the pineal body, which is where melatonin is produced. And melatonin, is a hormone that helps regulate your day-night cycles, causes you to go to sleep, is a major hormone that's located back there in that pineal gland, or the pineal body. It's part of the endocrine system. Remember, there's open spaces within the brain that we call ventricles. This is where that cerebrospinal fluid is going to flow. It also flows down through the spinal cord as well. So the epithalamus is an area where the cerebrospinal fluid is going to be produced. So your next question is going to be, teacher man, it's cool to look at those digital pictures and things like that, but where are these real structures located at in a dissected brain? Right here is your thalamus. Okay, so right here, this circular-like structure right here is your thalamus that we have right here. I should have gloves on, I'm sorry. For those of you guys that send me comments like, you should be wearing gloves, I'm sorry. This right here is your thalamus, and this is going to be that relay station for sensory impulses. Remember, if I look above the thalamus, it's this structure that's right here. This is my epithalamus, okay? So this is my epithalamus that's right here. This is where cerebral spinal fluid is going to be produced. You can see there's open spaces that are in there. Those are those ventricles that we have. And then towards the back is where your melatonin is going to be produced in there. Now, if I'm in my thalamus and I look down here is going to be my hypothalamus. Okay, so down here is going to be my hypothalamus. My pituitary gland is going to hang off down here. On this particular brain, this is a cheaper sheep brain where the pituitary gland has been removed. But this is going to be my hypothalamus. It's going to be here. And this leads us into our next discussion. Okay, so this is the diencephalon that we have. Now, this structure that's down here, this is my brainstem. and my brainstem's divided into the midbrain, and then we have this bulge right here. You can see there's a bulge right here. That bulge is my pons, and then this structure right here is my medulla oblongata. So it goes midbrain, pons, medulla oblongata. The midbrain, the pons, and medulla oblongata. Midbrain, pons, and medulla oblongata. The midbrain, the pons, and medulla oblongata. Midbrain, pons, and medulla oblongata. And then the medulla oblongata comes down here, and then it has this little curve right here, and then this is the start of my spinal cord that we have. And this is the start of my spinal cord officially. So this is the pons, that bulge right there is the pons. This is the midbrain, the pons, and then the medulla oblongata. And then right here is the end of my medulla oblongata, and now I'm fusing with the spinal cord. And that's what we're going to talk about next is the brain stem, that midbrain, the pons, and the medulla oblongata. So if you remember brain stem, midbrain, pons, medulla oblongata, you can see that there. You can see in this picture here, the sheep brain I'm having has like a lateral brain stem because it's a quadruped, we're bipedal. So this would be our midbrain that's right here. This bulge right here is our pons, and then this is our medulla oblongata that's hanging out there. We're just going to talk real briefly about what these structures do, and then that'll wrap up the brain lecture, which will be super cool, and you guys can really start studying then. So the midbrain is mostly composed of tracts of nerve fibers, a lot of axons running through this area. It's a reflex center for vision and hearing. So our visionary reflexes are going to go through there as well as our hearing reflexes. Remember, our visionary reflexes, our pupils are going to dilate depending upon the light condition that you're involved with. One way that they check for life is they will shine a light in your eye, and they will make sure that your pupils, they kind of close up. That's one way that we can check for life. We'll take a look about what a reflex is and how they happen over reflex arcs. That's another lecture that I'm going to talk about. That's the midbrain. The pons. The pons one of its major jobs is it's involved in controlling of breathing, as well as it does have a slight role in hearing as well. So it also has a slight role in hearing. And that's kind of what has a little bit of a role in balance and a little bit of a role in taste as well. But for all intents and purposes of this class, we're just going to think of the pons. One of its major functions is to control control breathing. Your medulla oblongata also has a control of breathing as well, but it has heart rate control, blood pressure regulation, breathing, like I said earlier, swallowing and vomiting as well are all controlled in the medulla oblongata. When I take a look at the brainstem, running through the brainstem, you have a dense area of gray matter, and this dense area of gray matter is called the reticular formation. So running through the whole entire brainstem, you have this area of dense gray matter that's here, and this is called the reticular formation. So this area right here of dense gray matter, remember gray matter is cell bodies, this is called the reticular formation. And the major function of the reticular formation, as we take a look up here, is to have the visceral control, the motor control of our visceral organs. So this is what's allowing like our large intestine, small intestine to kind of churn and move and go through that successive wave-like motion. It's allowing your stomach, your bladder to move. Your visceral organs are organs that are in your thoracic and abdominal pelvic cavity. So those are the organs that we're dealing with, and this is the motor control of them. These are things that are part of your unconscious thought that we have. We're not sitting here consciously thinking about my intestines moving, my bladder moving, my esophagus going through peristalsis. This is all controlled throughout that whole entire brainstem in the reticular formation, that area of gray matter. So that wraps out part 2 of the brain lecture. Hopefully that answers a lot of your questions that you may have struggled with and things like that. So hopefully I cleared some of those ideas up, and hopefully they can just kind of go through and you can kind of pause at those areas they needed more clarification for.